Welcome to Brave. Be inspired by the best leaders of Southeast Asia tech. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. I'm Jeremy Au, a VC, founder, and father. Join us for transcripts, analysis, and community at www.jeremyau.com. Hey, Aaron, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I'm so excited to see another UC Berkeley alum, founder, and corporate executive out here, Aaron, and I'm so excited to share your story.
Yeah, go Bears.
Go Bears. Woo, scoop ride. There we go. So, Aaron, for those who don't know you yet, how would you introduce yourself professionally?
Well, my name is Aaron Lim. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Previer. We're a startup based in Singapore with customers globally, working in the CRM space for people who work off their phone and use apps like WhatsApp.
So what were you like at UC Berkeley? Were you a party person? Were you one of those engineers stuck inside the ground?
I was definitely a combination of both. So I did EECS, electrical engineering and computer science. So definitely a lot of time spent in the lab, but I also lived on frat row. I played on the ice hockey team at Berkeley. I partied a lot, played a lot of video games. College was one of the best times of my life, especially at Cal.
Well, hopefully not the peak. So what games were you playing back then?
I played a lot of Halo. We had 4 TVs set up in my dorm room, and my friends would just come over. We would just play nonstop.
Oh man, 4-person LAN Halo. That must have been amazing. So much fun. I remember playing a lot of Halo as well. I like to pride myself that I was the best on my floor.
Yeah, the internet was extremely good at the time.
Yeah, that was a beautiful time. And so why did you decide to become someone who was studying computer science?
So this was actually not something I consciously did. When I applied to college, I applied as engineering undeclared, which meant I knew I wanted to do engineering. I knew I wanted to do something like math related, but I didn't know exactly what it was. And my parents, friends were suggesting, oh, why don't you do EECS, electrical engineering and computer science? And I thought that was all for people who had built computers when they were 12 years old. You hear all these stories of people who are, very tech savvy early on. Whereas my experience with computers is basically video games and PlayStation up until college. So I went in, I actually thought that I would be doing mechanical engineering because, very hands-on, very builder-esque type of role. But my first year at college, we took like introduction to computer science classes. I really, really fell in love with that. I just went deeper and deeper. And then I think by the second or third year, I had declared as electrical engineering and computer science, which I totally love. It was a bit of an accident, but I guess life found its way.
Life found its way. That's very Jurassic Park all of a sudden. So as you were doing this, and we were both in the Bay Area, right? And so is that where your love for engineering and startups bite you, or how did that happen? Because the first job you did when you left college was to work at a startup.
Yeah, so that was actually a complete accident. So unlike many other responsible college students who were taking internships and thinking about their futures, I spent a lot of my off time and summers just playing video games and doing things that I liked. And one of the things that I really loved was playing this video game called EverQuest at the time. It's one of the first big MMORPGs. And I became like a GM game master there on the server. And I helped build their websites and like these character profilers. And that's where I started building things people wanted. At the time, this was about 2006, 2007. Facebook started allowing people to create apps on their platform. So I started creating apps on Facebook as well. I didn't see these as kind of career decisions. It's just, let's just build something and see if people would use it. But being in the Bay Area, people start to notice, and then recruiters start reaching out. People were asking, leave college, quit, drop out, and join their startups. And just so happened in my third year, a CEO came to campus and found one of my best friends and myself and asked us to join his company, first as interns and then later as full-time as the first 2 employees. So that's kind of found me again. I wasn't looking for it, but I didn't know this was an actual job. I thought jobs had to be in a large corporate sitting and doing mundane work. And that was kind of my first introduction to entrepreneurship and just building stuff that people use. And that's how I first discovered that this is an actual thing.
What was it like being at the time, the director of engineering at a startup in 2007, 2008?
It was actually really interesting. So I was actually still in my last, 1 to 2 years of university when we started that company. And one of the most memorable things was, of course, I was still a student. So sometimes we would go to these conferences. I'd actually have two badges, one as a student and one as a representative of company. And one thing that we actually did, I actually haven't told anyone this, but I would go to competitors with the student badge. And because they're recruiting, they'll just pour out all the secrets and tell us all about their technology and everything. Then I'd come back and tell the CEO, I was like, yeah, ours is way better. So that was really interesting to see both sides of it, and also not to have to think too much about like responsibilities and career, because I was still a student. So everything else that I was doing was just experience I was picking up on then. But that was super fun.
So is that where you got bitten by the startup bug? Is that where you were like, okay, now that I've done this, I want to keep doing this?
Absolutely. So that's when I fell in love with engineering, fell in love with computer science, fell in love with startups. I did deviate from that later on, but that was absolutely where I got bit.
Can't wait to talk about some of those deviations soon. And so what was interesting is that you also made that decision to come back to Singapore to serve out your national service, where eventually you rose to the rank of captain and so on and so forth. But what was it like making a decision to come back from UC Berkeley and the Bay Area back to Singapore?
It was definitely not an easy decision. So I left Singapore. I was born in Singapore. I left when I was 4 years old. I came back right after I graduated when I was 20. So I spent about 17 years of my life, and basically all of my memorable life. Then my life was there, my friends were there, all my stuff was there that I had accumulated. And I didn't actually think about it too much until graduation. And my parents just showed up at my front door and knocked on the door and said, hey, here's your plane tickets, pack your stuff, we're going in 2 weeks. So even though I saw it coming, it was still a bit of a shock. Had to say all the goodbyes, had to move everything back. But I knew that it's something that had to be done. Resisted a bit as a young and naive kid would. Yeah, I knew that my family was here. At the very least, I had to come back and serve my duties to the country before I make any major decisions. And then after that, I could do what I wanted.
For me, it was opposite. I did my military service before UC Berkeley.
Yeah.
So I arrived on campus as a 21-year-old freshman who was very popular because I could become a dealer of alcohol on my dorm floor.
Definitely.
And of course, it was interesting where, it's just very focused and disciplined at school because it's very much focused on that. You're almost the opposite because you went into national service. And so you have finished college as well. So what was that like?
That was a huge culture shock. So there's multiple facets that were a shock. One is just Singapore culture in general, outside of Army, not just the culture, but the language, the food, the weather, of course, after growing up most of my life in Southern California and then Northern California. And then the other aspect was this Army specifically, where I'm coming in, I'm college educated, I've been independent, paying on my own, living on my own for 4+ years. And now I'm in this situation where kids younger than me are giving me orders and asking me why there's dust on my bed and making me do push-ups and stuff. So that was an extreme culture shock, just all around, especially in basic military training, BMT boot camp, the first 3 months. But after the first few months, I kind of got the hang of it, kind of was able to adapt, kind of changed the way that I spoke so people could understand me. And after that, it was quite good. I struggled for the first few weeks. I literally cried, sleep in the bunks. But after that, it was good, and I enjoyed my time.
Yeah, I would say every Singaporean male cries in national services. Everyone just hides it for like 2 years and another 10 years. And then it's a tough time because, it's like you said, it's a new culture for everybody as well. And obviously it's very tough physically and mentally as well. There you are and you do your 2 years. I'm just kind of curious, were there any benefits you took away from the experience?
Definitely. So I would say doing national service, aside from obligations and serving the country and defense, etc. One of the main things that I got personally was just the diversity of people that you interact with. Growing up in a small town in Southern California, everyone's kind of similar to yourself. I was one of the only Asians people would know. They would see my mom at a grocery store and be like, hey, you're Aaron's mom, because we're like the only Asians around. But everyone's kind of in the same area, background, socioeconomic status, etc. Going to Berkeley, you get a little bit more of that diversity, but you still have a choice in terms of, I don't want to say the choice, but you're still around people who are similar to you in terms of major, in terms of place in life, etc. But in Army, everything is just completely turned upside down. You don't get to choose who you're hanging out with, at least for the first few years. You're just put in this group of people who may or may not be similar to you, and you just need to understand who they are. So that really gave me an opportunity to understand all the different slices of society, good and bad, not just socioeconomically, but in terms of education, in terms of upbringing, in terms of values, in terms of priorities. I'd say that was probably my biggest takeaway in understanding not just Singapore, but the Asian region, which I hadn't spent a lot of time in before.
And so there you are, and you leave and you decide to join the world of finance at BlackRock, right?
Yes.
But of course, in a technology-ish role. So talk us a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So by the time I finished Army, my first startup had finished raising its Series A. It was on the verge of getting acquired. Ended up getting acquired by Good Technology, which was later acquired by BlackBerry. So that's not BlackBerry work. But so much had changed in the time that I was in Army, and there was so much opportunity that I saw in Asia that I decided, all right, let's just stay in Asia. Let's stay in Singapore. My family's here. Let's try something new. I can always go back to the US later on. Since we've already made the shift, let's stick around for a bit. I looked at the tech scene here, the startup scene here. This was about 2010. It wasn't too mature. And I also didn't really have a network of people because all the people that I knew were now going to university. They aren't looking to start startups. So I didn't have a network, especially in the tech scene. So I looked around at opportunities. I found this role in BlackRock. And although BlackRock is a very large institution, especially in finance, they're very different to me because one, they do invest extremely heavily into technologies. So they actually sell their technology externally, and it's a billion-dollar business. And the other thing was the role that I was looking at specifically was very unique in that it was launching technology across Asia where there was no existing team. So I was the only one in the region to actually do this. So it would have a lot more autonomy than a normal corporate role. So those are the things that really attracted it to me. Of course, BlackRock's a great company. Of course, financially, it makes a lot of sense. So I thought, if I'm not starting my own company here, let's do this to really see what tech could be at a large enterprise, what it looks like at, kind of its peak in a more mature stage, and then take those lessons later down the road to transfer into my own companies.
And that's what you did, right? Because you went from there to become a founder, your first time founder at Details.
Yes.
So tell us more about what was it like? Was it scary?
I would say it was a lot more exciting than it was scary, especially that time. So the first company, I wasn't the founder, I was director of engineering. But because we had joined as the first employees, it really felt like we were founders. But yes, it wasn't completely my own. When I was at BlackRock, I had an amazing time there. But the whole time I had in the back of my head, I didn't get to see the first startup through to the end, through acquisition and through maturity. So I really wanted to get back into that. So the second time I thought, all right, let's do this. I considered it to be my second startup, although it's absolutely the first one that I'm doing on my own. I completely underestimated it because you don't notice when things go well and you don't learn as much when things go well. So the first one went pretty smooth, at least the time that I was there. CEO and the team did an amazing job. And I was shielded from a lot of the nuances as to what actually happens in a company. So this time was a bit of a shock because I came in thinking that I already had one startup under my belt, but starting from complete scratch and a new environment without a team that I knew, it just on my own was a lot harder than I thought.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a lot of learning there about how hard it was. Now that you're many more years of wisdom, what would you say was the big difference between being an early employee versus being the founder as a first-time founder?
As a founder, you have to decide what you're even going to do. And it's just like completely open-ended. As an early employee, we had a direction that was set. We had investors already. The job was pretty clear. So as long as we did this particular job, the job was, of course, challenging, but as long as we did the job, at least your own role, your success was fairly certain. Whereas as a founder, I realized even if I did everything right, not to say right in the grand scheme of things, but everything as I had planned, as I had desired, it may still not get you anywhere. You could still be in square one, even though you did everything that you thought that you had set out to achieve.
And how did that work out for you over those 2 years that you worked on it?
So it did not work out well. The site's still live today, but I realized that had invested way too much in product. I'm a product person. I'm an engineer. I spent probably 90% of my time just coding and building and making features. Honestly, some of the features in that are probably more mature than the startup that I have today, which is much, much, much bigger and better than that one. But I just completely overbuilt. So that really helped me realize that building a product is one thing, but really getting the customer side of things and getting it out to people can be done extremely effectively, even without a perfect product. So that really helped me with my current startup.
So there you are, you spent your 3 years there, and that's when you transition into another brand name, which is the GIC, as the VP Knowledge and Collaboration. So what was that transition like, right? So obviously part of it was the push where your startup wasn't working, and there's also, I guess to some extent, some pull. But what was that transition? What was the thinking behind it? Because it feels like maybe you've gone straight into tech instead. You could have gone to Google. There's a lot of different places you could have gone to as well.
Yeah, that's a really good story. So as my second startup was winding down, we kind of saw the writing on the wall. We did see a path to potential success, but that required me to do something I wasn't very passionate about, which is create content nonstop on my platform to kind of show to the world or show to the local ecosystem how the platform should work. And I wasn't ready to make that commitment. So I looked at other jobs. I was looking at Google. I was looking at Facebook. I was looking at a number of other roles in more tech-centric companies. But I realized that for most of these companies, the tech centers aren't based out of Singapore. And most of the time, it's not based out of Asia at all. So the product decisions, the product ownership wasn't really here. Asia was more of an operations hub at that time for a lot of these tech companies. Whereas when I was actually referred by one of my army mates to this GIC opportunity. And at the time I looked at it, I was like, okay, like I know tech, I know finance. I didn't think that I was going to go back into the finance space. Yes, they pay well, but it's not typically what you think of a tech-focused startup entrepreneur type of mindset. But when I looked into this role, it was a brand new department that had been set up, the data analytics department. I met with some of the recruiters and managers there and realized that this was actually an extremely open-ended opportunity for me to not just launch, but build things from scratch. So at BlackRock, there was a CRM, a client relationship management platform, that was built in Seattle that I had to launch throughout Asia. So I wasn't as involved in the actual building, but I was very involved in the launching and the onboarding and the engagement across Asia. Whereas in GIC, these systems weren't even built yet. They were still being conceptualized. It was still very open-ended. So I saw this as an opportunity to take this different perspective of when we go from scratch and we talk to all the different stakeholders and the different teams, what does that process look like of building it from nothing to getting people use it and then launching it? So I saw that as a very exciting opportunity. Again, probably a bit more unique in the financial space compared to what's people usually think of. But yeah, I saw that as like the mini startup or mini entrepreneur path within a much larger organization.
And this is pretty interesting because there you are serving as a intrapreneur. Oh man,
yes.
The pronunciation of that is so tough. But as in someone who's like I said, internal entrepreneur, that's a tough role, right? For any other large organization, let alone GIC.
For sure.
So what would you say accounted for your ability and success in serving that role?
I'd say direct access to the stakeholders. So I did a couple of projects there, some big, some small. But the most successful ones, we would always have direct access to, investment professionals, the stakeholders that are actually using it. So in any sort of corporate setup, one of the big issues that happens is that you have stakeholders who aren't users. And they're giving all of the requirements. They're telling you what you should build, what you shouldn't build. And you have to listen to them because they're the ones that make the decisions. And oftentimes you build something, they're happy with it, and then you roll it out and no one actually uses it. And then they're not happy with it anymore. But I would say for the successful projects, the things that really made the difference were where we're able to cut everyone else out and just focus on here's the people that are actually going to be using it. Here's the people that are going to be championing it. They have no agenda or thoughts other than how am I going to be using this on a day-to-day basis? And we just cut through everything else, all the translations, all the different stakeholder opinions. This is what you want. This is what we're going to build. And it's no surprise to anyone when we actually launch it that it's actually being used.
It still feels tough. I mean, feels like a lot of meetings.
Yeah, we had a ton of meetings, but the most successful ones were the ones where it was just one layer. And here's the actual users, and here's like the product and engineering team, and they're just all in one. Whereas most of the time, there's actually quite a few layers in between, especially in larger organizations with multiple departments, multiple teams, multiple stakeholders. So the ones where we're able to just cut and streamline at the most, I personally felt went the smoothest and were the most successful.
What advice do you have for these meetings, these alignment meetings where you have stakeholders who are users, which feels like a normal meeting, and then you have stakeholders who are not users as part of that meeting as well? So what advice would you have for people to have that meeting?
If you're in a large company, there's usually a hierarchy of people. They are, for better or for worse, different people's opinions hold different weights. So if you can get the actual users to champion your ideas back to them and channel those back to the stakeholders, it makes a lot more sense. So just to give a very concrete example, partially hypothetical example, if you have technology telling management and stakeholders what they should be doing, that usually doesn't end up really well because usually technology listens to the stakeholders, the management. But if you have the users telling management and stakeholders, this is what we want to use, then that usually goes well. The issue is most of the time the users just know the problem that they have, but they don't necessarily know the best way to solve it, which is what technology is able to do and a good product manager, a good product team is able to provide. So what has worked well in the past is you get the users to share their problems directly with technology. Technology and product then shares and comes up with various approaches and tests those using common startup methodologies, MVPs, and then sells those back, pitches those back to the users. When the users are happy with it, the users then pitch that to management. So it's actually technology's idea floating up to management, but it's coming through as a user's idea. So management is typically a bit more open to these suggestions rather than hearing directly from technology, whereas the common stereotype is that technology doesn't understand people and engineers don't get how people work. So their words aren't taken as seriously. That's the unfortunate reality across most companies. Of course, it's not always the case. And there's a lot of teams that handled it well that I came across at GIC and BlackRock, but that's a common setup. So usually funneling all the ideas and all the feedback through the users, but having technology and product kind of implant those ideas and concepts and work those out with the users directly before floating it up.
And there you are. You successfully deploy a couple of systems and deployments. And then you decide that you want to go build again as a founder. So talk us through that. And then eventually chose to go via EF as well, entrepreneur first.
Yes. So that was not an easy decision. And I'll be completely honest that I thought that my startup days were behind me at least for a couple of decades. So after my second startup, my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, said, you have this much time. Now go get a real job. Let's start a family. Let's get married. Let's do all these adult things, which we did when I went to GIC. At the end of 2017, we had bought a house. We had just gotten married. My wife was not working, and it was not a good time for me to start a company. It was not even on my radar. I knew it was something that I wanted to do, but I assumed that it'd be something that I would do 20 years' time when my kids have gone to college and I'd be a bit more financially free. But EF, Entrepreneur First, reached out. They sent a couple of cold emails. I thought they were just complete scams at the time. But then I actually read one of them and it seemed pretty legit. I replied, I met up with them. It seemed interesting, but of course it was still a really, really big risk given financial commitments. My wife wasn't working at the time. We had a mortgage, etc. So I met up with them. It seemed pretty interesting. And we were actually able to arrange for me to take a sabbatical so that I could limit risk instead of just leaving. I took a 6-month sabbatical from GIC. They were very kind to offer me that. And I went to go through EF in the beginning of 2018. And the deal was, look, if it goes well, great. At least we've de-risked a lot. We can look at continuing. If it doesn't go well, then just take it as a short break and we go back to normal life. So that helped to mitigate risk a bit, but it was something that I take no credit in discovering on my own. EF gets all the credit for pulling me out. And again, I guess just fate deemed that I should be going after another startup.
Yeah. And there you are as an experienced founder, and you decided to go with Entrepreneur First, which is very focused. And I think I've been part of that program as well. Mm-hmm. And I remember asking you for advice and about your experience. Yeah. But for the benefit of everyone listening, I'd love to hear about it. Like, what was the experience like going to Entrepreneur First as an experienced founder?
So EF is very interesting. And I think they've proven that their model works. They recently just had their first $1 billion company that was born out of the program. And I see a lot of successful companies coming out of it as well. For me, going in as an experienced founder, it was a bit different because my priorities were not necessarily aligned with what most people, when they go to EF, they're thinking, I'm a first-time founder. Maybe I've spent my life in academia, or maybe I've spent my life in the industry. I need someone to kind of show me the way of how to start a company so that we can make it successful. Of course, they help you find a co-founder, they'll do the funding and all these types of things. But a lot of the attraction is just help me start my first startup. I'm coming in and my co-founder was in the same situation. We've done startups before. We didn't really value, or we weren't looking for that aspect as much. But the two things that really stuck out to me and that turned out to be the most valuable was, one, finding a co-founder, being able to be in a room with 100 plus extremely ambitious, qualified, risk-taking entrepreneurs who are not just all of those things, but ready to start a company right now. Timing is always an issue. You always have friends that want to start companies, but okay, maybe let's do it in 6 months, let's do it in a year, let's do it in 2 years. There's always a different timing. So one part I was looking at was just finding a co-founder. And the second part was just having an extremely defined structure for if this is working or not. As founders, we are by nature optimists. We always hope that things will work out. And that's why we start startups despite the odds. But the reality is sometimes you just have to pull the plug and you need to set a timeline. And we're not great at setting those ourselves, at least I'm not. But with the EF structure, there was kind of okay, at 3 months, you're either passing the investment committee and getting further investment or you're not. At 6 months, you're either raising a seed round or you're not. And that was very important to me, and even more important to my wife, to help mitigate some of the costs of and risks associated with starting a company when we had a lot more financial responsibilities and real life things to consider.
I think one of the questions that people always ask, and this is something that you had done twice by then, was find a co-founder, right?
Yeah.
Which seems to be like a tough question all the time.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is you did the first one where you found your co-founder yourself, and the second time was to some extent match made as well. So tell us, walk us through what the difference is and what the similarities are.
Yeah. So I would say the most important thing when finding a co-founder after going through all of these experiences is really finding someone that aligns with the vision of what you're trying to build and why you're trying to build it. People start startups for many, many different reasons. A lot of people see starting a startup as a quick way to get something nice on the resume so that they can apply to an MBA program in 1 or 2 years. Some people see it as a way to fill gaps in their time when they can't find the perfect job in corporate. Some people just think that it's very exciting and they think that they're going to exit, sell it for a couple $1 million in 2 to 3 years. Where some people see it as, I just want to build this product, introduce it to the world, and money and all this other stuff. Yes, hopefully it comes, but that's not the main driving factor. Now, there's nothing right or wrong about any of those answers, but making sure that there's alignment within the co-founders is extremely, extremely important. Because if you're mismatching between those two things, you run into a lot of issues. The other thing that I would say is, especially with EF, when you have so many people to choose from, and you can just go through all their different profiles and see this is their backgrounds, this is what they're good at, this is what they're not good at. We tend to actually over-optimize for things on paper. We start to think about, this is the idea that we have, and I just need this one missing piece, and we try and find someone to just fill that gap. And I personally feel that that's not the best approach. Yes, you may find a co-founder that you think fills in the gaps that you're missing, If it's a co-founder, then it should be someone that you're sharing the vision with and they're contributing to overall company rather than filling a gap that you have. That's more of an employee that you're filling the gap with. So I always tell people going into EF, have an idea of the problem that you want to solve. You can have ideas of like skill sets and gaps that you have, but instead of trying to find someone to fit that, talk to everyone that you can about the problem and see how they would sit and see how they would approach it. And maybe their approach is so unique and novel, taking their extremely unique backgrounds and experiences, that when you combine those two together, it's something that both of you truly own. It's something that most people in the world wouldn't even think of doing. And it's something that I think the most important thing is like both of you have ownership over it. Both of you are excited by the vision rather than it's your vision and someone else is kind of helping you build it.
That's a tough one, right? Which is feeling that equal yet complementary dynamic. It's a tough one to get. And
yeah, for sure.
I think a lot of founders find themselves in suboptimal situations, right? Who are like unequal but complementary or equal but similar.
Yes.
So how should they think about it? I mean, what advice would you give if you find someone who's kind of facing that situation?
I'd say if you're looking at something where it's unequal but complementary, a lot of the times it's unequal because of the way that you've set it up. If you say, this is my idea and it's going to work exactly in XYZ manner, and I just need someone to do X, then you're coming in with a mindset that the company is actually already more or less complete in your head, and this person's just filling in that gap. And of course, in that situation, you're going to feel that it's unequal because it was your idea, you've come up with the entire concept, you've validated various parts of it, and this other person's coming in and they're not contributing as much to it. But if you're truly looking for a co-founder, and I appreciate that this isn't always possible, but if you're truly looking for a co-founder and you're in the early stages, really starting from scratch, you can have a problem in mind, you can have some approaches in mind, but really having both co-founders build up the idea, the approach, the product vision, all of these things together, that inherently removes this concept of unequalness because you're really building it from scratch rather than plug and playing someone else into it. So that's my personal take. I know it's not always possible, but if it is at all possible, if you're just starting from scratch, if you're still in college or you're just thinking about starting your startup, I would highly suggest that as a way. It may be a bit harder in the short term, but after your first 6 months or so, it just makes life a lot easier and it will create a much more truly differentiated product and company than if you just had one person.
And I think there's something that you talk about, right? Giving advice to other founders and everything. What's it like feeling like a second-time founder? Because there's a lot of folks that we meet who are first-time founders or they're starting very young or right out of college or in college. And these whippersnappers are out building it. Like, any thoughts about what advice you normally would give them?
I'd say, obviously, starting a company for the second time or the third time or the fifth time, you're taking in a lot more lessons. You're starting a little bit further. You're starting with a bit more experience. And I would say in no way is that required. Of course, we see a lot of amazing companies being started by first-time founders. So people shouldn't ever be afraid of starting their own company. Some people say, oh, I want to work for another startup or I want to work for a larger company so that I get experience in doing it. But nothing will ever prepare you for starting your first startup. Even starting your first startup won't prepare you sufficiently for starting your second startup. There's always going to be that learning curve. Everything's always going to be different. So I wouldn't say be scared of starting your first company. I'd say if you know this is what you want to do, just get it out of the way as soon as possible. Just start, just do something. But of course, the more startups that you either start or even work for, or even if you work for a large company like Google or Facebook, you always can take different lessons into it. I'd say always keep your mind open. You never want to be the smartest person in the room. You never want to think that you have it figured out. I'd say starting my second startup, I felt a lot more lost than I did my first startup, despite having gone through it multiple times. And I'd say that's probably the bigger thing, which is going in knowing that no matter how much experience or how many startups that you've worked at or founded previously, there's still a lot more to learn and not getting too complacent over thinking that you figured out how to build a product or you figured out how to fundraise or you figured out how to do any particular thing. It's always going to be different. Don't worry too much about it. But at the same time, always look at the lessons of other founders, of podcasts, of books, YouTube videos, etc., and just to soak in that knowledge.
Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom there. And speaking of wisdom, could you tell us of a time when you were brave?
I think probably the bravest moment was just leaving GIC. Things were going very well there. The team there was fantastic. The bosses were fantastic. Of course, it's a great company. Things were going really well. Again, I had just bought a house that I definitely cannot afford now. My wife was not working. Basically, I had made all of my financial plans and decisions in life around assuming that I was going to be at GIC for at least 5, 10 plus years. So taking that leap was huge, not just for me personally, but for friends, for family. There's a lot of speculation that happens over like, oh, why would someone do this? Like, did you lose your job? My dad literally told me, people don't start companies because they have options. People have start companies because they don't have options. He has started companies in the past, not in technology, but he comes from that sort of mindset. I guess dealing with all of these different perspectives, I wouldn't say I was brave, but I was absolutely uncertain. Was this the right decision to make? But end of the day, for anyone out there that's thinking about starting a startup, at the end of the day, life has a known ending. We're all just going to be at the end of our lives one day. And the specific decisions that we make may not play a huge part in where that actually ends up. So just knowing that no matter what you do, it's going to be all right. So if you want to take a risk, there's no better time than now. That's kind of what kept me sane and helped me with bravery. No matter what happened, we'll be okay. We're in Singapore. What's the worst that's going to happen?
And you're speaking about something that's really interesting because from the outside in, it is a very brave action that you left your cushy GIC job with your assumed lifestyle that was built on the assumption that you were at GIC for a couple more years to build a startup, right? So from the outside in, it's brave, but on the inside out, you're describing it as something that was uncertainty, that you didn't see yourself as brave, but you felt confident in your own way. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is the difference between the outside in view of that as bravery versus the inside out, where you seem confident enough to do it and make the call while discussing that with your partner and leaving the job and the lifestyle? So I'm just kind of curious how you think about it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that helped me was, I mean, this is very engineer of me, but I literally took out a spreadsheet. And I didn't say like, how much money am I going to make or any of that stuff, right? That's completely unknown. Or it's known in the corporate path, but it's completely unknown. And most of the time, if you're starting a company, you're not ending with a better financial outcome than after the probability distribution. It's not a better financial outcome than if you were to just stay with corporate. But what I actually did was at a high level, I plotted out what would be the difference in my life with the various outcomes. So there's a few different outcomes, but I realized that even in the worst case, it wasn't going to ruin our lives. Maybe we would have to sell the house. Maybe we wouldn't be able to have kids as early. Maybe we wouldn't be able to eat out as much. Maybe life wouldn't be as comfortable. But in no situation was it we're going millions of dollars into debt. In no situation are we sacrificing huge parts of health. Of course, I don't count gray hairs and lack of sleep as huge parts of health, but in terms of disease or any sort of that, long-term things aren't really sacrificed. And that gave me comfort that no matter what happens, as long as we are logical and go about it in a good way, there's a floor to how bad it could get, especially if you're in a country and a situation like Singapore where worst case that happens, you're still in an all right situation. So I think those are the things that gave me comfort, not the day-to-day lack of giving up small perks in lifestyle, but more of knowing that these types of decisions aren't going to affect super long-term health or super long-term longevity or family or anything like that. That's what really helped me reconcile those.
Wow. Thanks so much, Aaron. So I just want to kind of paraphrase what you just shared, just to wrap things up here. The three big themes that I got from you was, I think, first of all, thank you for sharing about what you were like as a college Halo playing, beer drinking student doing computer engineering. And it was just interesting to see how that your early anecdotes about how you were as a professional at a startup and how you caught the bug was just a fun ride into who you are.
Absolutely.
And how you got started in the technology world. The second thing I really appreciated, of course, was the entire discussion about what was it like in terms of the chronology of switching or toggling between the army to startup and then to corporate and then back to startup again. So definitely some interesting dynamics here around what you've learned each time around. And I think the tips around being that entrepreneurial person within companies, but also tips around being the entrepreneur and founder when you're doing your own startup. And I think that's a really interesting set of compare and contrast dynamics that most people don't really have. And I think it's nice just to have you to share that at a high level. And lastly, I think thank you so much for sharing about, I think, the concept of risk and de-risking. Like, what's the worst case scenario? You mentioned a couple of times along the entire interview. What's the life that you want to live? And I think that was a very thoughtful way of saying, how should one be a founder in that sense, but also the intuition to just go and be a founder. And I think that's not an easy debate, let alone have one with yourself. But it was nice just to hear how you went about approaching it and making it easier for yourself.
Yeah, I hope it was useful.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeremy, for having me.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share this episode with friends and colleagues. Sign up at www.jeremyau.com to discuss this episode with other community members in our forum. Stay well and stay brave.